Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to Access Mob's community lecture event. Today's topic is navigating your need for a service or support animal. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Elisa Grishman. I use she, her pronouns. I am a fat white woman with brown curly hair. I am wearing a black shirt with an awareness ribbon that says, "Together we can find the cure for ableism." Our interpreter today is a white man with brown hair and salt and pepper beard and glasses and a gray shirt. I want to welcome everyone who is attending. Thank you so much for being here. I especially want to thank my board of directors, Debbie, Donna, Kendra, Mallory, Monica, Nyota, and Reggie. I want to thank our meeting facilitator, Katie. Huge thanks to Disability Pride Pennsylvania for being our fiscal sponsor and just a wonderful organization to work with. And the biggest thanks of all to the Opportunity Fund, who is supporting our work that we do today. This meeting is being recorded. Closed captions are available, and a link to a transcript will be in the chat. Please remain muted and turn your cameras off. Chat is disabled between participants. You may create a new chat with Access Mob Pittsburgh host in the chat if you have a question or a problem. If you need to see how, the link is being posted in the chat now. If there is time for a Q&A at the end, please raise your hand with a virtual reaction or let the facilitator know if there's a problem and wait to be called on. You will be asked to unmute and/or turn on your camera. You may ask your question verbally or in ASL, or type questions in the chat for Access Mob to read out loud. Do not turn on your camera unless you need to speak ASL, and wait for the interpreter to acknowledge you. If you are calling in on your phone today, you can use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute or unmute. If we don't have time for questions, you can email your questions either to accessmobpittsburgh@gmail.com. That's AccessMobPittsburgh. Or at the end, the speakers will be giving their contact info and you can contact them directly. There will be a survey going out at the end of the lecture this afternoon. Please, if you could fill it out, it really helps us learn more about who's attending, how we're doing, how we can do better, and it's just super important. I'll also be sending out all the links that were in the lecture today so that you can click on them at your own leisure. And I will be putting those links in the YouTube video later. It's a reminder to everyone, myself, speakers, and if you are asking a question, please speak slowly and clearly so that the interpreter can keep up. Without further ado, then, I would like to welcome our speakers today. We have Rachel Shepard and Megan Hammond. Rachel is the Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, the city's civil rights enforcement agency. Charged with enforcing the rights of marginalized community members, she strives to empower individuals to assert their rights under the law, dismantle discriminatory practices, and foster a more inclusive and equitable society. By leveraging community partnerships and collaboration, she envisions a future where every individual is afforded dignity, respect, and equal opportunity. Rachel has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, years of experience in the legal field, and has held multiple positions with the Commission since 2016. Megan Hammond is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. The Fair Housing Partnership is a fair housing organization with the sole mission of advocating for and enforcing federal, state, and local fair housing laws. Megan has 13 years of experience at the Fair Housing Partnership and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from Carnegie Mellon University. Without further ado, please take it away, Rachel and Megan.
Thank you, Elisa, and everyone at Access Mob for allowing us to be here today to explain more about this very poignant topic. My name is Rachel Shepard. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman in her late 30s with dark brown hair. Today it is slicked back and pulled up in a clip. I have a sage green shirt that says "Home is where yins are" on today, and my favorite earrings with a green leaf pattern dangling. So we're here to explore navigating your need for a service or support animal. This is in partnership between the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations and the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. And with that, I will allow Megan to introduce herself.
Good Saturday afternoon, everyone. I am Megan Hammond. I'm a white woman with brown hair wearing a blue Hawaiian shirt to enjoy this warm weather on Saturday. And as you'll hear more about today, Rachel and the Pittsburgh Commission addresses discrimination and service and support animal access in a multitude of forms. And at FHP, our sole focus and work is ensuring access and housing.
Thank you, Megan. Megan is our partner for all things fair housing, and we do a lot of outreach and education throughout the year. So if there's ever a topic that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to us. We will provide contact information at the end.
Rachel, I'm going to interrupt 1 second. Your camera turned itself off.
Oh no. Okay, there we go. Is that back?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'm having limited visibility here with the presentation. Okay, and so our first slide is just the title slide of navigating your need for a service or support animal. We do have the logos for the City of Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations and the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. My next slide is for PGHCHR. That is the acronym we use for the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. And what we do have one of our new logos on the top right here that is Yins Belong. The Yins is in gold and the Belong is in black. We've done this logo in a couple of different ways. We have a pride theme, we have a disability theme, a Juneteenth theme. So if you see us out and about, ask us for a sticker. So to explain a little bit more about what the commission does, we primarily investigate complaints of discrimination. Our goal is to alleviate all types of discrimination within the city of Pittsburgh. We know that that is a lofty goal. And so we do take individual complaints and we try to make the most of them. The categories that we receive discrimination complaints in are employment, housing, public accommodations, and the delivery of city services, including the Pittsburgh Police. Our jurisdiction is limited to the city of Pittsburgh. The criteria is that your complaint must be based on membership in one or more protected classes. The harm must have occurred in the past year and within the city boundaries. However, if your harm happened elsewhere, still call us. we can refer you to someone who can help. Again, our jurisdiction is just within the city limits. The Fair Housing Partnership, or FHP, they operate in all of the greater Pittsburgh area, including outside the city limits.
So this slide says FHP, what we do, and it has FHP's logo. We were created in 1984 and have been a Fair Housing Initiative Program, or FIP. As a private nonprofit, our sole focus is fair housing advocacy. We do investigation and testing, advocacy and legal assistance, as well as education and outreach. And as Rachel said, we serve Western Pennsylvania as well as areas in Pennsylvania that are underserved or don't have a fair housing organization, which has effectively become all of Pennsylvania except for the greater Southeast or the greater Philadelphia area. One of the most routine day-to-day things that we do are reasonable accommodations on behalf of individuals to their housing provider, whether that's a landlord or an insurance agency. And we also engage with landlords and other housing providers about their rights and responsibilities under the housing discrimination laws. So you are more than welcome to always reach out with a question. My friends and family have banned me from speaking about fair housing unless they have a question. So I love talking about fair housing and answering housing questions whenever possible.
Thank you, Megan. So our first content slide says, what kind of animal is it? And we've got a small graphic of a little yellow dog wearing a blue service vest with a little cross on it. And our definitions here are for service animals, which are any dog individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability. This includes physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disabilities. Miniature horses may also qualify in certain circumstances. Those are the only two animals for service animals. Like to counter that, we have our definition of emotional support animals, which are animals that provide comfort and alleviate symptoms of a disability. Most often, they are animals commonly kept in households. They do not require training. Now, that is the main difference between our service animal friends and our ESAs, which is the acronym we use for emotional support animals. I have to qualify that neither of these animals is considered a pet, and both are related to a disability specifically. Our next slide says, where can the animal go? And there's a small graphic top right of a little apartment building in brown, shades of brown with some green trees around it. In general, service animals are permitted just about anywhere that the owner can go. Sometimes this requires an accommodation and sometimes not. There are a lot of rules that go along with this, but very, very generally, service animals can go where their owners can go. On the flip side, we have the emotional support animals who are only permitted in housing. And that is one of the biggest issues that we see with our housing complaints are folks who have a need for an ESA and don't know how to adequately communicate that to their landlord or the property manager. They don't know when or how to communicate. They don't know what is required. And that is exactly why we're doing this here today, because we want everyone to be armed with as much information as they possibly can so that they can advocate for themselves during a time where rights are constantly under attack, especially disability rights. My next slide says service animals in employment, your rights. These rights are protected by Title I of the ADA, which stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the PCC, which is the Pittsburgh City Code. It is also enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, and the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, or PGHCHR. You can ask for an accommodation to have your service animal with you at work based on your disability needs. However, these requests are fact-based and require a case-by-case analysis. Every situation is different. Your work location may come into play. The people in your work location will come into play. And all things need to be considered before a service animal can be granted as an accommodation in the workplace. Our graphic on this slide is 3 fists pumped to the air in varying shades of skin color. Our next slide is on what is a reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is a policy, practice, or process in the job or work environment in order to enable a qualified person to perform the essential functions of the job and for the worker to enjoy equal benefits and privileges in the workplace. Reasonable accommodations can be many things. We see a lot of sort of different requests in the employment space, a lot of outright denials by employers, and a lot of employers who really do know how to handle the interactive process and to assess the reasonableness of an accommodation request. But the whole goal is that if you are a person qualified for that position and you can perform all of the essential functions of that job with an accommodation, they have to consider that. The accommodation cannot impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. So when we're talking about whether something is reasonable in the employment space, again, there are many factors to consider, but some considerations include physical safety, potential changes or interruptions to operations, and the type of workplace. Our graphic here is a brown desk with a computer monitor on it and a stack of books. But that is not the only type of workspace where this accommodation may be needed. And so that is why considering the type of workplace is essential for assessing whether it's an undue hardship for the employer to have that service animal on the premises. Moving now to service animals in public and the laws. Your rights to have a service animal are protected by Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which covers governments and their services. These protections are enforced by the Department of Justice, or the DOJ. There is also Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which covers places of public accommodation. This is also enforced by the DOJ. And then third, we have section 659.04 and 659.07 of the Pittsburgh City Code, which cover public accommodations and city services, respectively. And this is enforced by the PGHCHR. When we say enforced, that means if you feel your rights have been violated, you may file a complaint of discrimination, of disparate treatment, of denial of accommodations with those agencies. Our next slide is service animal exemptions in public. There are some exemptions to where a service animal can be in a public arena. Specifically, religious institutions and organizations are specifically exempt from the ADA and do not have to permit service animals. This includes all services and programs, both religious and not. If you are unsure if the program you are asking to have your service animal be present for is part of a religious institution and whether or not this exemption applies, please contact us. We're happy to work through that with you. An example of a business that may also disallow service animals if they can prove that allowing them would fundamentally alter the nature of their services or programs. I should note that this is very rare. Our example, and including our little graphic here, which is some trees at the entrance and a sign that says zoo. At a zoo, service animals can be restricted from areas where the animals on display are the natural prey or natural predators of dogs, where the presence of a dog would be disruptive, causing the displayed animals to behave aggressively or become agitated. It becomes a safety issue, not because the assumption is that your service animal will act out, that they will act out of character. It is more for their protection and the protection of everyone around them, because the wild animals, despite being domesticated in the zoo, are not actually domesticated animals, and they may act in an aggressive way. It's more for everyone's protection. Again, these kinds of exemptions where there's a fundamental alteration to the nature of the services or programs is very rare. If you experience this kind of denial within the city of Pittsburgh, where you're being told the service animal may not enter and they have not given you any sort of reason for it, you can report this to the Commission on Human Relations. Our next slide is on service animals in public, your rights. This is important to note because you have to be your own advocate. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. As a person with a disability, you have to advocate for what you need on a regular basis, and this is part of that. So when you're out in a public space, they cannot ask for training paperwork because a dog does not have to be professionally trained to be a service dog, and there may not be any paperwork. They cannot ask for a certification or registration because there is no such registry in the United States. There is no master registry or certification program for service animals in the United States. They cannot ask you to have a special vest or harness on your animal. We like to say that a service animal patch does not guarantee that it's a service animal. Anyone can buy those patches online and slap them on the side of their dog's vest and then try to bring them into a public space. We know that this is done. We do not agree with it, and we do agree that it violates the rights of the people who truly need their service animals to be able to be in public spaces. Finally, the folks in those businesses in public cannot ask for a demonstration of what the animal is trained to do. They are not a circus performer, neither are you. You do not have to provide any sort of demonstration on what the animal actually is tasked to do. You may only be asked 2 questions. These next two questions are all that they are permitted to ask, and sometimes they won't even ask these because they're in fear for their liability. The first question is the animal required because of a disability? Is this a service animal? The second question is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? They can ask you what the task is, but again, no demonstration required. I'm sure no one wants to, on demand, have to show how their service animal alerts to low blood sugar or how they alert for a seizure. You can't force those things to happen. And why would you want to? So again, those are the two questions that may be asked by the business, by the police, by anyone when you are out in a public space. But our next section is on service animals in public. These are your responsibilities. You do have certain responsibilities as a service dog handler, as a person who utilizes a service dog for your disability. The animal must be trained to do a task related to a disability. Animals in training are not covered as service animals by the ADA or the Pittsburgh City Code. So please be mindful of that if you are a person who is doing owner training, that your active training does not mean that you will be permitted to have that service animal in a public space where pets are not allowed. They do have to be trained. Again, it doesn't have to be professionally trained. They can be owner trained. In fact, owner trained dogs often behave better and operate more effectively with their owner and their handler because they've been taught from the very beginning exactly what that person needs. The animal must also be under your control. This means on a leash or harness, unless those things hinder the dog's ability to do its task. There will be scenarios where people will insist that the dog be leashed. If that will absolutely hinder its ability to do the task, you do not have to leash them. Again, this will come up with challenges of undue hardship or changing operations. But in general, as long as that animal is under your control, you are okay. Your animal must also be housebroken. I'm sure we've all seen the supposed service dogs out in the grocery store who lift their leg and make a deposit in a time where they really should not even be in the store. These are the dogs that are giving service animals a bad name, and the owners are violating the law and taking advantage of the laws that are here to support folks with disabilities. And it's just wrong. But being housebroken is a real basic one. If you're going to go out in a public space, the dog cannot be urinating or defecating anywhere in that public space. Our fourth point is that the animal must not be a direct threat or safety risk. And certain locations may limit where a service animal can go for safety reasons. Again, we gave the example before of the zoo because it's a very obvious safety risk when you have these animals that have inherent prey or predator drives, and it could be very, very dangerous for the folks that are involved and the animals themselves. But when we say that they must not be a direct threat or safety risk, we mean the supposed service dog who's sitting in the cart at Walmart and has its lovely service dog vest, but is aggressively trying to escape its owner to attack the people around it because it is reacting to those people. Your dog cannot be snapping out on anyone. It cannot be running around and jumping on people. But again, a trained service animal is not going to do things like that. That is the difference. That is what we like to point out in those public service spaces, is that if it's a real service animal, 9 times out of 10, they are not going to react in that way because they are trained not to. They are trained to do their task unless they are told by their handler that they can be released to do other things. And the final thing on this list is that the animal must be licensed. Not as a service animal, because we talked about how there's no registry or certification process for that, but just as a dog. If you are in a municipality that requires licensing of your animal, they do have to be licensed. This is for the safety and security of everyone around. It is for the safety of your animal should they get away from you for whatever reason, if you get separated. And so the licensing is essential. I would note that as a public accommodation, the dog licensing should not be overly burdensome to people with service animals. And extra proof should not be required to show that it is a service animal. Again, there are not always medical records or training records associated with an animal to prove that it is a actual service animal. So we actually just changed this process with the finance department in the city of Pittsburgh. The form no longer requires that medical documentation, and you can now do a self-attestation to say this animal is a service animal. This is the task that they are trained to perform. And then you can sign off on that, and that will waive the dog license fee here in Pittsburgh. Now, it's not always like that. Other municipalities may still charge, and they're within their rights to charge for the dog license because they're charging it for everyone. But in the city of Pittsburgh, to get that fee waived, you can show that you have a service animal to get it done. We're going to shift gears into our most complex category for the service and support animals, and that is housing. This slide specifically is on service animals and housing and the laws associated with that. So your rights to have a service animal in housing are protected by the Fair Housing Act, which covers the dwelling itself and the process of obtaining the housing. The Americans with Disabilities Act covers public spaces in housing, like leasing offices and community spaces. And this can also apply during property tours. And then finally on here is Section 504, which covers publicly funded entities. Next, if we're looking at service animals and housing specifically under the Americans with Disabilities Act, depending on the circumstances, housing providers as defined and covered under the Fair Housing Act, or FHA, could also fall under the provisions of the ADA. So those are common areas around an apartment complex that are open to or accessible by the public. The business office, which could qualify as not only housing, but public accommodation and as an employer, in addition to housing-related matters. Housing programs that are administered by the state and local governments, such as public housing authorities, and housing provided by public and private universities. So there is some overlap between laws regarding service animals in housing. And our graphic here is another set of a few apartment buildings in blue, yellow, and pink. Now, more generally, And I'm going to refer to service and support animals collectively as assistance animals when we're referring to them both in housing. Because again, there are some protections that'll apply to both of those types of animals. So if there's ever any question, please let us know at the end and we can help differentiate if there's questions. So we're focusing now on assistance animals in housing, your responsibilities. Because as in every situation, you as the person who is handling and owning that animal, you have responsibilities that you have to fulfill. The first is that property damage or injury caused by the animal is your responsibility. This is often one of the reasons that there will be denials of assistance animals in housing, especially when there is a no pets policy. But the animal is covered just as well as you are by that lease. If that animal causes damage or injury, it's the same as if you caused that damage or injury, and you will be responsible. You are also responsible for caring for the animal, including feeding, cleaning up after them, licensing them, and inoculation. So those vaccines that are essential in that municipality, usually identified with the licensing process. I believe in the city of Pittsburgh, it is the rabies vaccine that is required. This is probably required everywhere, but I can't speak for everywhere. And then finally, as we've already talked about with the public spaces, keeping control of the animal. Because while they are permitted in your space as a right, once you get out into other spaces, you do have to be able to keep control of that animal so that they are not wandering the halls, they are not running around the courtyard, they're not in the lobby, wandering around. Like, you still have to have full control of your animal. I will note that it is not an accommodation for the housing provider to care for your animal. This has come up in the past where a person will say, I need the assistance animal, and I also need assistance with taking care of the animal. That is your responsibility. It is not the responsibility of the housing provider to care for your animal in any way, shape, or form. The graphic on this page is a woman with mid-tone skin and brown hair, looking sort of ashamed with a finger pointed at her and a yellow background. And now we'll move into your housing rights under the Fair Housing Act, or FHA, and the Pittsburgh City Code, PCC. To have an assistance animal, you may request a reasonable accommodation to have a service or support animal in your housing when there is a no pets policy, or to stop fees from being assessed when animals are permitted. Medical records, diagnoses, and/or detailed information about a disability are almost never necessary to make that request. We will go into more about what is required. But a diagnosis and specific medical records, access to those things are not necessary in most scenarios. You, as the tenant, are entitled to an interactive process with the housing provider, especially when your request is considered unreasonable by that housing provider. They have to work with you to try to come up with a solution. A flat-out denial is not appropriate. There needs to be an interactive process where you are working together to find a solution. And finally, you are protected from retaliation for requesting an accommodation. Requesting a reasonable accommodation in housing or in the public space or in employment is what we call a protected activity. you can file a discrimination complaint based on retaliation for engaging in a protected activity. So if you request the accommodation and suddenly you're being ghosted and you lose an opportunity for the dwelling, that could be retaliatory. If you make the request for an accommodation and suddenly you receive an eviction notice, that could be retaliatory. Retaliation is a field that you can file under for housing discrimination. And our graphic on this page is a medical file folder in blue with some records sticking out of it. To continue your rights, your housing rights under the Fair Housing Act and Pittsburgh City Code, and our graphic here is a little not allowed circle, red circle with a yellow dog in it. You cannot be charged additional fees or deposits for service or support animals. They are not pets in a housing transaction. The dog is essentially considered medical equipment. They are not a pet. They should not be subject to the same fees and policies of a pet. The housing provider cannot limit the number of service or support animals a tenant has. This is a very specific situation that is for the tenant to determine, and it may require additional documentation. It may require additional time to assess, but we will talk about that a little bit more. Finally, as a right, a housing provider cannot stall or delay a response to a request for a service or support animal, or take adverse action against a tenant who makes a request for a service or support animal. The housing provider has to respond to you. If you ask for the accommodation, they have to respond within a reasonable amount of time. This is up for debate what is actually considered reasonable. I tend to recommend that people give a reasonable deadline when they're making their request so that they have a solid date to refer to if the landlord does not respond. So more information on what does reasonable accommodation mean in the housing space. A reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that may be necessary for a person with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling, including the public and common use spaces, or for a housing provider to fulfill their program obligations. Again, the most common reasonable accommodation that we see in the housing space is for emotional support animals, and we're here to support you with that. Once a request is made, showing that a requested accommodation, in quote, may be necessary, end quote, requires three things. You must be someone with a disability as defined by the Fair Housing Act. In quote, an identifiable relationship or nexus between, end quote, the accommodation and the disability. You have to be able to easily identify the connection between the accommodation you're asking for and the disability symptoms that need to be alleviated. And third, you're required to show that the accommodation is, in quote, reasonable, end quote. So how does someone make a request? Reasonable accommodation requests can be communicated in any way: verbal, email, text, carrier pigeon, it doesn't matter. But it is best practice to make the request in writing. I note that if you make a request in a form other than writing, please follow it up with a letter of understanding. You want to be able to document as much of this process as you can. And while I don't necessarily consider that a responsibility for a person with a service or support animal, it is for your protection. The request must be made in a way that a reasonable person would understand it to be a request for an exception, change, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service because of a disability. We use that reasonable person standard a lot in the discrimination field. And so it's just, if you were talking to someone and having a conversation about your animal, would they understand that that's you making a request? Some criteria for your request: identify yourself as a person with a disability. That will qualify you for showing that you are a person that is qualified with a disability under the Fair Housing Act. Explain the connection between the disability and the need for the animal. What symptoms do they alleviate? And for a service animal, this could be, what task are they trained to do? And then for ESAs, it could be, oh, they alleviate my anxiety so that I can live independently and be able to stay overnight without panicking. Just as an example. And then third, we have that you must provide reliable third-party documentation for the request. Housing providers will often lean on medical paperwork specifically for emotional support animals and service animals, but that is not the only reliable third party that can provide documentation. And I believe it's 2 slides from now that we'll cover what a reliable third party entails. When and who can make the request? So reasonable accommodation requests can be made anytime during the tenancy. This includes when asking about a place, when looking at a place before a lease or sales agreement is even discussed or signed, after signing the lease or sales agreement, but before taking possession, and after taking possession. So at any time through the housing process, as you are trying to obtain that housing, you can make that request for an animal. In terms of who can make the request, it's most often the person with the disability, or it could be a family member, a friend, an agent, their aide or caretaker or advocate, an advocacy organization, an attorney, basically anyone else who is acting on the person's behalf. So if the person has limited means of communication, it can be others. It does not have to be straight from the tenant's mouth. Who can provide the information? And this is where we're talking about those reliable third parties and who can be included in it. A doctor or other medical professional, and that aligns with our little graphic on the side with a white-skinned blonde woman with a blue clipboard with paperwork on it and a badge hanging around her neck. Also a peer support group, a non-medical service agency, or a family member or housing/support services advocate. Any of these folks who are in a position to know about the individual's disability. The person who has the best information about the disability and the need for the accommodation is the person with the disability. But oftentimes the landlord will not go with that, and they need this third-party information. And so we have seen cases where a a war veteran used his peer support group to write a letter to the landlord to say that he needed his ESA because they could see the visible difference in his demeanor and his ability to relax after having served with him when his dog was around. So just as an example. When is an accommodation request unreasonable? In housing, a request is unreasonable if it would impose an undue financial and, in bold, administrative burden on the housing provider, or it would fundamentally alter the nature of the provider's operations. A failure to reach an agreement on an accommodation request is effectively a decision by the provider not to grant the requested accommodation. So we're saying if you're in that interactive process with your housing provider and they just give you an alternative and aren't willing to budge from that and are no longer willing to interact with you, that can amount to a denial. However, and I italicize this section, it does not necessarily mean that the denial was unlawful. This will need to be assessed. If an agreement cannot be reached, the requester may file an agency or court complaint, and the agency or court will have to determine if the denial was unlawful. Again, when you're making a reasonable accommodation request, the request that is made is not necessarily what will be granted. It is not always the best way. It's a little different when it comes to the animals, but in general, with reasonable accommodation requests, if you're making that request and there's an interactive process, you may have to settle for something other than what you asked for, depending on whether it's an undue financial and administrative burden, or if it would fundamentally alter the nature of those providers' operations. So this slide is about some extra things that go along with the service and support animals. I'm going to look particularly at the support animals on this slide. So what about these? For unique or exotic animals, you will need to provide the date of the last consultation with your third party, the unique circumstances justifying the need for a particular animal or species, and third, whether the third party has information about this animal or specifically recommends a certain species. If we're not talking about a support animal that is a dog or a cat or a guinea pig or an iguana, if we start getting into the more exotic space with a sugar glider or a hedgehog, I'm trying to think of something even more bizarre that's been realistic. I'm sure Megan has examples for us. But if it gets into that territory, you may need to provide extra information on why that specific type of animal is essential for you. Why are they the animal that provides you that emotional support? And then likewise, if you have multiple animals, each emotional support animal will require an explanation. And any animal that is not a service or support animal is subject to the rules in the lease. So you can have multiple animals. If you are in a pet-friendly building and you have 3 dogs and a cat, I don't know anybody that would allow 3 dogs in an apartment, but maybe it's a large apartment. If you've got all those animals, but only your cat is the support animal, those dogs will then qualify as pets and be liable under the lease for any pet fees, deposits, etc., that are required. The support animal would not. But again, you have to make that request. so that you can get that exemption there. The threshold for showing that an ESA is necessary is a lot higher for more than 2 animals. There are scenarios where you may have a service animal and a support animal, and those will each require explanations. If you have more than one support animal, there must be a unique reason, a nexus for each animal and the disability symptoms. And it can be much harder to get an accommodation for more than 2 animals. So please keep that in mind as you're moving through the process. And our graphic on this page is a sheet of paper with a question mark in a circle and a small cat face on the lower left. Assistance animals who pose a direct threat. This situation requires a case-by-case, fact-based determination regarding the specific animal that's in question. Does the animal have some kind of history of harming people or damaging property? Or is it just an assumption by the housing provider? Housing providers may not have a blanket policy against dangerous breeds. And I'm putting that in quotations because I don't necessarily believe that there are dangerous breeds, only owners who create dangerous animals through training. They can't have a blanket policy against that, even if their lease says that they ban those breeds. It is not applicable to service or support animals. And the issue of insurance policies often comes up as a reason to not grant accommodations. In those situations, the housing provider must engage in the interactive process with the insurance company and may have to get a different insurance coverage. The accommodation process can escalate, so you make the request to the housing provider. And if they say, oh, my insurance needs an exception, they need to be the ones to pursue that and to get that exception considered by the insurance company and to find a solution. If that doesn't work out, the insurance company can also be liable for housing discrimination. So it's not limited to a landlord, it's not limited to a property manager. It can be the insurance company. And while this doesn't apply in Pittsburgh, some municipalities do have breed bans, and you may have to ask for an exception there as well from the municipality. Okay, we have made it to the point where we are asking you all to give us questions. What can we answer for you? We know that this is not a comprehensive training. It is not a deep dive, but we did want to provide some very essential information for you all so that you could at least get started with the process.
Hi, everyone. This is a reminder that if you have a question, raise your hand using the in-app hand raise option. If you are having a problem with that, or if you would like to ask your write your question out for the facilitator to read out loud, you can type it to Access Mob Pittsburgh in the chat. Please wait to be called on, and as soon as you are called on, you will be given the option to unmute yourself. Please leave your camera off unless you are asking your question in ASL. We have one question already from Donna. Donna, if you can ask your question.
You may not know the answer to this, but is the changing landscape at the Department of Justice affecting anything about how these policies are administered at your level?
So go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to speak for Pittsburgh really quick, and then I'll let Megan answer that one. But for Pittsburgh, this is not affecting the way that we are handling anything. If you have a public accommodation situation with a service animal, you can contact us. We are still accepting those complaints as usual. The federal process has not impacted our process, but Megan can speak to beyond that.
So to further contextualize what Donna is referencing, is that a series of events have begun that are a bit unprecedented. This is particularly impacting the housing space, but presumably we'll see it in other civil rights spaces as well, but specifically about service and emotional support animals at this time. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, you don't need to be in federally funded housing to have a fair housing case filed at what's called HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, which is known as FHEO, the federal version of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. What HUD has done in recent months is that they have issued a memo that HUD is no longer accepting housing discrimination complaints based on emotional support animals. As Donna has referenced, this has had a reverberating impact and has caused a lot of bad information that Rachel and I have been trying to field in Pittsburgh and throughout Pennsylvania. And so one goal of this presentation was to help understand and set the baseline that no laws have changed. There's been no legal precedent that has changed that has made fundamental alterations to what the typical practices are. And so as Rachel stated in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations continues to take cases on emotional support animals, but they will no longer be reimbursed by HUD as they were previously for those cases. So that speaks to the need for local Pittsburgh-based investment in the Pittsburgh Commission's work. Similarly, for organizations such as mine, Fair Housing Organization, HUD is largely no longer permitting certain activities with our federal funds, including regarding assisting people based on emotional support animals. However, we pursue and continue to advocate and assist however possible. So what we want people to know in Pittsburgh particularly is that cases continue to move forward. Outside of Pittsburgh, we can still file at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, or PHRC. Additionally, HUD's own memo about emotional support animal identifies that we can still litigate. No legislation has changed, just the administrative process in which HUD will no longer take the cases. And so we are still pursuing cases. We are still engaging with housing providers that the laws continue to exist. We have to be mindful based on where a person is or a landlord is about what the administrative agency is that's applicable to them and what all the specific laws are. There's some additional laws that can apply to Pennsylvania as a whole. Additionally, I'll add, if anyone's interested, there's a fascinating case that happened about emotional support animals at HUD and DOJ in the previous federal administration that was about a homeowner and a cooperative in New York City regarding emotional support parrots. And so there's recent cases even under DOJ with tremendous support for emotional support animals. But to maintain and be aware that every case is case by case, we need to look at the details of it, need to establish the case, and that we need to understand how it fits within the current federal landscape in which there's no longer support at HUD FHEO or at the Department of Justice for pursuing these cases, particularly in housing.
Does anyone else have a question? That was a phenomenal question, by the way, Donna. I had been considering asking something similar, so thank you for that. Maybe I'll ask a question. Do we have any questions that have been asked in the chat?
Yes, there is one from
Go ahead.
Percy. Hi, this is your neighborhood streaming facilitator. I am not on screen. Percy is asking, how do you suggest navigating disclosure and requests for accommodations for employment? Is it better to be forefront and tell employers or prior or during the interview and application process, or is it better to wait until employment offer or after accepting to request those accommodations, specifically in reference to service animals?
That's a good question. So we very rarely actually see complaints made in the employment space that relate to the hiring process. We know it's happening, especially for folks who may need to come in for an in-person interview and have a service animal that needs to come with them, and they may need to ask the accommodation for that. In that scenario, I would absolutely recommend making the request at the time of the scheduling for the interview. Be upfront about it, because if there are any specific questions that need to be asked or things that need to be put in place to allow for that animal to be present during the interview, you want them to be aware of that. It's if they start giving you the runaround after you make mention of that, that it could be a red flag. Then when you're actually in a job, you don't necessarily need to bring it up during the interview process if your animal does not need to be with you during an interview, or maybe it's a virtual interview so it doesn't come up. When you're actually in the job, if it is something that's essential for you, I would communicate it to HR as soon as you possibly can. It could go, and if you don't have that connection with HR yet and it's just the hiring manager, it can be communicated to them as well. One of the things that I did not mention about reasonable accommodations is that whomever receives that request, if they're not the right person to assess and make a decision, they have to escalate that. And they need to know that they need to escalate that. So that is one of those things that we teach in our Fair Housing for Landlords training, is that if you're a maintenance worker and you receive a request for an accommodation, you need to escalate that to the property manager or whoever you report to so that it can get into the right hands for a decision. And so same goes with employment. Whoever you make that request to, it needs to go to whoever the person making the decision is. It's usually someone in human resources. And then you can have that interactive process from there.
Okay, Deborah, go ahead and ask your question. Debbie, I saw your hand go down. Do you not have a question anymore?
No, just had a momentary tag on the unmute button.
Ah.
So a question on ESAs in apartments. Are they allowed in common areas that are like social areas? Obviously, they need to be allowed to be able to walk through, to go out, to go out to use, to go to the bathroom and everything. But for example, a social room, would that be someplace that they are allowed to be brought, or is that someplace that they normally would not be allowed?
So it's a good question because that is particularly a gray area. Emotional support animals are specifically allowed under the fair housing laws. But if anyone here recalls, is that under the ADA in 2008 or 2010, emotional support animals were removed from the ADA, largely because of unruly behavior that was happening in restaurants. And then in 2020, the Air Carrier Access Act, which governs planes themselves, the Department of Transportation removed the requirement that planes have to allow emotional support animals. So the way we treat that is if a person approaches us, a tenant, where they need the emotional support animal to be allowable in the common areas where you're spending time, as you're saying, in a social gathering, then it can certainly be addressed. We have seen also sometimes the landlord's rules about how an emotional support animal can be transported through the common areas to take outside for a walk or to use the bathroom can be overly stringent. And so we also work to make sure that those rules are about, they're reasonable, is that a dog can be leashed and can walk through the lobby. We had a case a while ago where it was a high rise, a senior high rise, and they said you had to carry your emotional support dog, through the lobby. The halls were not allowed to touch the ground. And a tenant used a walker who had an emotional support dog, who was physically unable to use her dog, use her walker. And so she asked that she be allowed for her dog to walk on the floor, which is perfectly typical. And the property management then told her that she could buy a wagon, put the dog in the wagon, and then tow the wagon across the lobby in order to take the dog outside. Well, again, that was physically impossible and also completely unnecessary. And so, we had to get involved to make sure that, you're allowed to, the dog has to be under your control, cannot be free roaming as an emotional support animal. But that the landlords can't go overly stringent at the same time. And that the paws can touch the ground. It's allowable and reasonable to get the dog outside. A cat or another animal that isn't typically leashed, can be in a carrier. And so every case will be case by case basis. Spending time in the social areas such as a community room, a pool, that's something we'll handle on a case by case basis. Because the public areas or the common areas will fall under the ADA the most, where it's more about a service animal. But we have done work in making sure when tenants need to have an emotional support animal in the common areas as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, the pool is a good point with the service animals, because that may be another place where there's an exception for whether the animal how far can the animal go? So are they allowed in the locker room? Are they allowed on the pool deck? Typically those things are permitted for a service animal, but being actually in the pool is not. So just as an FYI for anyone that may apply to.
Okay, we have time for one more question. So AJ, please go ahead. And then after this, if anyone has more questions, comments, anything like that, we will be providing you contact info so you can ask one-on-one. So AJ, please go ahead.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I missed the first part of the talk. So I actually have multiple questions. So what would be the best thing for me to do?
Well, first of all, if you missed the first part of the talk, I mentioned this at the beginning. I'll be sending out an email that's going to have this survey and all that, a survey and whatnot. It will also include a link to the recorded video on YouTube, so you can go back and rewatch the whole thing from the beginning. So if you have questions that you think are just things that would have been covered at the beginning, I'd say hold out and watch the video. But if you have a specific question, now would be a good time to do it.
Okay, all right. Let me just pick a question. I appreciate that. Let me just pick a question from the list that I have here. So in terms of co-ops, like condo associations, and also landlords, how would I respond when I bring up ESA and they say to me, no pets allowed? How do I respond to that? That's my question.
So what happens is that a co-op, a HOA, a landlord, they're allowed to have the rule that there's no pets allowed. And so what it is that we're asking is we're asking for a reasonable accommodation, a change to that rule based on my disability and the symptoms that are relevant. So what are my symptoms that require the service or emotional support animal? So in order to engage, the first step is to explain that we recognize that what the rule is, which is no pets. And so I'm asking as a person with a disability for a reasonable accommodation, which is a change to that rule in which my service or emotional support animal is allowed. And Rachel and I can engage one-on-one with further specifics about doing that process.
Okay, that sounds like that's help. I appreciate that. That sounds like that's helpful if I'm already renting. And I'm sorry if I wasn't very clear. What about during the search process, if I encounter that?
So in the search process, what I recommend is that it's complex. And so what happens is that we want to make sure that the request is being made after
Oh,
you've been accepted as a tenant or an applicant or a buyer. Because what happens when we file a fair housing case is that the housing provider doesn't say, I didn't do it. They say, I did. I did deny their tenancy application or their co-op application. But what they need to argue is that they did that denial for a non-discriminatory reason. So my suggestion is to get the approval based on whatever the application process entails. That's the income requirements, the credit requirements, any criminal screening. And then once we have that, to then follow up with the reasonable accommodation request itself, respectfully and in good faith and engaging. But I explained to landlords that I advise this because there's so many moments, as we all understand, in which we're not sure if something happened because of a disability. And so the best practice I found is to get that you're approved. There's no discriminatory reason for the denial, and then to follow up with the accommodation request before you move in.
I see. Okay. Thank you so much, Megan. I appreciate that. And thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We don't have anything else written in the comments, I assume.
There was an additional question from Ruth. At what point would you recommend that I mention my emotional support animal with a landlord during a search for a place that doesn't normally allow them, so they cannot discriminate?
Sounds like that was just answered.
Yes, I would give the same. It's I tell both tenants and landlords for the tenant to get the approval for the application for the unit, but to make sure to make the accommodation request prior to moving in.
Okay, well, if anyone else has any questions or comments, I'll let Rachel and Megan describe their slide in a second, but there's contact info for both of our speakers, or you can email accessmobpittsburgh with Pittsburgh spelled out at gmail.com.
Thanks, Elisa. So our final slide today is for if anyone does have questions, and we do encourage you to contact us. No question is stupid or too small. We really do want to hear from you. We would rather be able to navigate these issues before they become a legal issue than after. I know that's not always in your power as a potential tenant or employee or citizen of the world, but if we can do it, then we will try. So our contact information for the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. We are located in the City County Building in downtown Pittsburgh. That is 414 Grant Street, room 908. And we put the note in there that it is the Ross Street side of the building because there are elevators that will go up to 9 on the other side and not get you to us. Our phone number is 412-255-2600. And our general email is human.relations@pittsburghpa, all spelled out, .gov. Likewise, for the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh, their offices are at 5428 Walnut Street in Pittsburgh, PA, 15232. Their phone number is 412-391-2535. And Megan herself can be reached at Megan, that's MEGAN, at pittsburghfairhousing.org. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you. And if you would move on to our next. Thank you again, Rachel and Megan, for a wonderful lecture. I really did learn a lot, and this was a really important topic. I have a slide on the screen right now that says upcoming events. We have a number of upcoming events. You can check out uh, any of the lecture nights that I will be mentioning in a second at accessmobpittsburgh.org. There is a drop-down menu that says Community Lecture Series, and you can find then specific lectures from that. All of our lectures are virtual only, so I will say I'm going to do this out of order from how the slide is written, but that's okay. And there's QR codes for all of these on the slide right now. But our next lecture is on Monday, September 28th at 6 p.m. Thinking Outside of the Box, Employment and Persons with Disabilities. And on Monday, November 23rd at 6 p.m., Equitable, transparent access to data and the disability community in the city of Pittsburgh. We have some other events too. For those of you unfamiliar, the Safe Sidewalks Crew is a program co-started by Access Mob that's collecting data on the condition of sidewalks in Pittsburgh to help the city better allocate funding for making repairs, things like that. It's entirely volunteer driven, and we need more volunteers collecting data. Our next virtual training is on Tuesday, August 11th. We also have other trainings coming up, and we have group activities, neighborhood blitzes. If you go to www.pittsburghwalks.org/safe sidewalks, and I'll put these links in the YouTube video as well and in the email I sent out. You'll find info about our upcoming Safe Sidewalks crew work. On Saturday, September 26th from 12 to 4 is the annual Disability Pride celebration here in Pittsburgh. It's a wonderful time to come out and celebrate our vibrant, amazing, wonderful community and, be together. There's going to be a resource fair. There's fun activities. It's family friendly. I think there's face painting. There's a little bit of everything. So we really encourage folks to show up. And finally, Thursday, October 1st through Thursday, October 8th is the Week Without Driving. This will be the third year that Access Mob has helped co-run this in the county. And it's a week to really uplift the experience of the fact that 30% of Americans either can't or don't drive, and the need for alternate methods of transportation, discussing the fact that there are a lot of people who feel that they can't live without a car, and why that is and how we can change that. There's going to be an Access Mob specific activity that I will be announcing later, working with Adaptive Pogo to do rides on their adaptive cycling equipment, and inviting disabled folks to come out and do that. So we encourage everyone to come out. Final slide, please. So I once again want to give out a bunch of thanks to my board, Debbie, Donna, Kendra, Mallory, Monica, Nyota, and Reggie. I'm sorry to our interpreter. I just did that way too fast. But many thanks to Katie, who is our meeting facilitator. Thank you to Disability Pride Pennsylvania for being our sponsor and for being wonderful. And thank you to the Opportunity Fund for the grant that has helped us keep this running. We are, a 501c3 nonprofit, and we run on donations from people attending events like this. We have a slide on the screen right now with QR codes to our PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. If you do decide to do any of those, which thank you, please be sure to put AMP or Access Mob Pittsburgh in the payment section. To find other ways to donate, you can go to our website, accessmobpittsburgh.org/donate, and there's direct links to do any of these things from your computer. So thank you again to Rachel and Megan. Thank you to everyone who's come out today to attend this lecture, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.